Vincent looked up at the castle before him, its towering stance and golden decorations. He was disgusted. The knights have gone too far this time, he thought. Somehow, the knights had brought into physical form an object outside of time and space called the Helmet of Time. They used it to go across time, dimensions, and different timelines so they could build different structures. Essentially, they built megastructures, not across galaxies, but across entire timelines. During a recent heist, the Gnomes had managed to get hold of this sacred artifact, but at a cost. Half of their forces were gone, and the Knights had trillions of forces from different timelines, all collectively providing materials to a singularity, the massive castle known as Hell's Bane. It was flowing with lava, machinery, and magical runes, a modgepot of every single culture beyond the timelines, and every resource they brought there was put into one army. Vincent was a simple soldier, not in any form of power. However, he wanted to take down the Knights, possibly more than anyone else. The Gnomes' plan was simple. There were 3 timelines that supplied the Knights with most of their resources. Some split off billions of years before the Gnomes and Knights conflict, some only 100 years earlier, but each one of them was a pure example of the Knights' reign. Each one where the Knights got most of their resources. So if they took them out, the Knights' entire kingdom would buckle under itself and fall to the Gnomes. You may be wondering, why do the Gnomes want to take out the Knights? It's simple. The Knights committed genocide on the Gnomes, taking out half their forces 100 years ago. And then they tried to make the Gnomes their slaves. The details have been lost to time, but the Gnomes remember that day. Not the details, not what happened, but what the Knights did to the Gnomes. Not physically, but emotionally. Their entire culture changed from that day forward. The first timeline they seized was one of dragons, full of fire breathers. Dragons were beasts of burden. This timeline split off millions of years ago, where a change in evolutionary circumstances meant that dragons ended up outcompeting early proto-mammals, and they survived to the asteroid. Now, recently, dragons had started evolving new forms, and the ones mainly bred in the castle of this timeline to be sent to the main one were beasts of burden of pure darkness. You couldn't see their form. They were almost two-dimensional in how their scales, their entire form, absorbed light. And so, the Gnomes made sure to attack this settlement in the bright daytime, where they knew the dragons would be at a disadvantage, but not as much of one as the Gnomes hoped. At first, the Gnomes had the upper hand because of the element of surprise. They attacked the breeding facilities of all the dragons, and now the dragons were naturally able to defend themselves, but not nearly as well when they weren't expecting it, and the actual soldiers of the castle weren't actually there to protect the dragons, as the breeding facilities had tight locks that stopped the soldiers as well as the Gnomes, but the Gnomes had managed to get through unnoticed and re-locked it again. They killed almost all the dragons until an alarm started blaring through the facility. All the soldiers began running out as if it was about to combust, but it didn't explode. However, some of the Gnomes wished it had. The castle collapsed, bricks and the dirt underneath it falling into a pit. It was metal, more futuristic than the Knights usually have, and clearly holding purple energy that was what helped transport themselves to other timelines. It was full of crates and boxes, possibly full of resources from this reality that were going to be sent to another. However, from the ground rose a colossal knight, bigger than all the others, with a massive buster sword. Its purpose? To kill. It was charged with energy, possibly from the crystals that scattered its form, fueling it as it burst out of the ground with electricity. It swung its sword and in a clean sweep took out 10 gnomes, who were all standing, their bows aimed. Now, gnomes didn't have the same weapons knights had. Knights had swords, axes, and a bunch of technology the gnomes hadn't discovered. But gnomes had something knights didn't have, a sixth sense that allowed them to tap into the fifth dimension. All the knights knew that the fourth dimension was time. What they thought was that the fifth dimension was another area of space. The gnomes knew about time, and they knew about the true fifth dimension, magic. The battle lasted almost an hour, but the gnomes had an upper hand, because it was the knights' job to flee the castle if this ever happened. They left, and the gnomes didn't have to fight them, only this monster. They used their magic to block up the knight's systems, and after that, they just had to outlast it. That hour was spent with the knight's electricity backing up, and near the end, it simply stopped halfway through a swing, its sword clattering to the ground as the knight fell. Sparks of electricity lined the floor, scorching it, but the gnomes had lived, most of them, and they'd kept the helmet of time. Knights flooded the area, but the gnomes didn't care about that. They'd taken out possibly the biggest superweapon in the Knights' Empire and one of their biggest dragon suppliers. They used the helmet of time, and whilst it took time, they managed to defend themselves with a force field, and they took out into another timeline. Vincent has had his arm cut off in the fight by the Knight's Buster Sword. He had it amputated on the flight home. You see, the gnomes had rudimentary technology, like giant wooden birds. They flew through the skies. He had it amputated, but what happened was, it was amputated with extra magical equipment, and the magic seeped into his system. And the next timeline he'd be in, Vincent made a shocking discovery. The next time they travelled to seemed pretty normal. There was a castle on a hill, yeah, and big by most standards, but it didn't seem like the gnomes were doing anything helpful by getting rid of this one. But the castle was actually a cover for a mine of a resource called duplicacium. Vincent and his friend Casey, who he had spent the entire gnome training school together, went in. Duplicacium was a crystal-like resource that spread throughout the mines at rapid speeds. The knights used it to build their armour, and the armour was self-repairing, as well as absorbing kinetic energy. Vincent and Casey went in, along with all the others, almost instantly. And when he went in, Vincent made a shocking discovery. As they opened the door to a mine, an entire massive sound burst crashed out, destroying the entire castle. And it turns out, since duplicacium trapped echoes, the entire thing had been trapped in one giant echo. It destroyed the entire castle, but each of the soldiers wearing duplicacium armour were just powered up. The gnomes were on the back foot because of this, and whilst they'd successfully destroyed the research, the excess magical energy in the area stopped them from getting out with the helmet of time. And even if they did manage to get out, they still had excess duplicacium from the mine. Now, the mine was opened, and the gnomes all rushed in, creating formations of force fields and shields, protecting them from the knights. Though the knights had better weapons, and they were almost breaking through the force fields, the gnomes were all trapped together, stuck in a force field, a singular one. Now, they could have easily stopped this force field and all went in separate directions to try and help the knights further. But if they did, it was likely that at least half of their forces would be taken out whilst they did it by the knights. Vincent soon realises what he was able to do. The magic courses through a system, and he creates a force field bigger than any the gnomes had ever created, and the bolts of magical energy both struck the knights' duplicacium armours and the rest of the mines. It all began collapsing in on itself, echoes bursting out and destroying more of the mines, which will just trap more echoes. It was an infinite cycle of collapsing, the mines being destroyed before the gnomes' very eyes, and Vincent was able to protect the rest of the gnomes with a force field. Now, most force fields were solid on both sides, but the most advanced ones were able to have things from the inside shoot out, whilst things on the outside would stay out. Vincent was the first person to ever achieve this force field, and as soon as it was discovered, more were able to. Vincent had unknowingly, accidentally, created something that would be instrumental in helping the gnomes win the war. The entire gnome population, soldiers or otherwise, travelled to the final timeline. Now, this wasn't one that sent out resources to the main castle. This was the main castle, a collection of resources, and whilst the knights would still exist, scattered throughout timelines, not only would they not be able to reach each other, but also there would be a loss of mass resources. And so as the gnomes stormed up to their castle, they created golems and massive magical beasts to fight. Vincent and Casey were put on the front lines from their savings of all the gnomes in the previous timeline. They became generals. Everyone looked up to them. They breached the castle and a mass war took out, bigger than any of the others. The gnomes and the knights all fought each other, and nearly both their populations were halved, except for those in timelines yet to be discovered. However, Vincent and Casey managed to get inside. Bonding as they did, they got to the central chamber. However, they were swarmed by knights. Even vast mega weapons, the same ones as a mechanical robot in the first timeline they'd breached. As they closed in on them, Vincent whispered under his breath a spell, the most powerful one able to take place in a gnome body. Or, not for long, however. As Casey's beard exploded into golden light, he burst out, his frame grew. Vincent knew what he had to do. He jumped behind some crates, and as Casey's entire body burst into golden flames, the entire castle was taken down. The spell was one where you could destroy anything you put your mind to, including yourself. However, you could also stop anyone from being hurt. It was a kamikaze move. Vincent never forgave him for it, but he was also thankful of what he'd done to finally end the battle. But the war was far from over.